Hello, I'm François Houÿez, Director of Treatment Information and Access at the European Organization for Rare Diseases, EURORDIS, and I'd like to explain you exactly what I explained to the French association Ouvrir les Yeux, the French group for Leber Hereditary Optic Neuropathy, after the developer of a gene therapy withdrew its application to the European Medicines Agency for marketing authorization. A few things you need to know about the disease. First, that this important gene, the NADH dehydrogenase 4 mutation, was discovered by Wallace in 1988. And what this mutation does is that the mitochondria of the optic nerve don't work properly, don't work enough to produce the energy needed for the optic nerve to transmit the signal from the retina to the brain. The brain cannot proceed the information anymore. In 1991, the Institut de la Vision started basic research and preclinical research on the gene therapy to target this precise gene, and this was largely funded by public investments from universities and donors. Secondly, in May 2011, the Institut de la Vision obtained an orphan drug designation in Europe with financial and scientific incentives for the development and the commercialization of the product, designation which was then transferred to Genzyme Biologics in 2013 in the frame of a signed agreement for the co-development of the gene therapy between the Institut de la Vision and Genzyme. By that time, it was estimated that 51,000 people were living with the disease in Europe and European Economic Area, and around 1,400 to 1,500 new cases would occur each year in the US and in the EU. Thirdly, by that time, Genzyme Biologics was a recently created French company developing gene therapies for the eyes, for rare eye diseases, and they had two products in their portfolio, and you see here at the top that Lumevoq and Adogene Nolparvovec was the most advanced of their two products, with first a submission of a marketing authorization application to the EU and then to the US based on phase 3 clinical trials the company had conducted. Point 4, in 2019, so that was really when the development was well advanced, the company was facing bankruptcy due to lack of equity, and it was rescued by a Chinese investor, 3S Bio, that invested a total of 20 million euros, including 9 million in equity in exchange for an exclusive license for China. You should also know that when the disease starts, it usually starts with one eye, but the other eye is affected in the same year than the first eye in 97% of the patients, and for 25%, both eyes are affected simultaneously. And this mutation represents the vast majority of people with Leber optic neuropathy, 75%, and is the most severe form of the disease, which is an excellent candidate to be targeted by a gene therapy. This is how the disease manifests in patients, losing the central vision in one eye and then the other eye, and progressively this blurring dot evolves and enlarges, and at the end you only have some peripheral vision, which is not clear at all. You can barely read letters or see movements, and ultimately all people become legally blind. So these are the first two clinical trials, phase 3, conducted by the company. The main difference between the reverse one and the rescue was the duration of the disease. In reverse, patients were more advanced. They had suffered from LH1 for 6 months or less than a year. And in the second case, for rescue, the disease had started less than 6 months before. But for both clinical trials, there were double-blinded randomized clinical trials where, in fact, for each patient, one eye was randomly assigned to receive the gene therapy, and the other eye would receive a sham treatment, just putting a plastic device on the eye. Nothing was injected. And the primary endpoints after 48 weeks, so a year, would be the mean difference from the moment the gene therapy was injected to the end of the clinical trial at week 48, but also the comparison between the two eyes, the one treated and the eye untreated. So these were some of the results as shown by the company itself in a meeting in 2022 in London by Magali Tayel, the Chief Medical Officer of the company. And here you see, and again, the two criteria were the change from baseline and the comparison between both eyes at 48 weeks. Here they show the change from nadir. This is the lowest, the worst vision during the clinical trial. So the change between the moment the vision was the most affected and the moment the vision was evaluated at the end of the trial. When they said they would compare from baseline to the end of the trial. And they say they observed that in average, compared to the beginning, to the worst moment, the patients could see 15 letters more in both clinical trials, which means 5 lines on the eye chart, where 3 is enough to reach clinical meaningfulness. However, and this is what you can read at the bottom, the primary endpoint was not met. Was not met because you see no difference between the treated eyes with the gene therapy and the sham-treated eyes in numbers of letters that patients could see, compared here to nadir. And why this? And the company says they did not know this would occur. But what happened was that, and they published, they conducted research, they paid for research to understand this. The gene therapy injected in one eye would have an effect on the other eye. If minute quantities of the gene therapy would pass, it is not known exactly how, from one eye to the other. So if the gene therapy has an effect, it would have an effect not only on the treated eye, but on the contralateral eye as well, which means that at the end of the 48 week, when you compare the vision in one eye, the one that received the gene therapy initially, and the other eye with a sham treatment, there was no difference between both eyes because the vision improved in both eyes. So the company realized they were facing a difficulty, and that's only at that time that they conducted research in monkeys, injecting the gene therapy in one eye and measuring the passage, the effect of the gene therapy into the other eye. They did not do this research prior to testing the gene therapy in human, and that was a mistake from them, because would they have understood, would they have known that the gene therapy would pass from one eye to the other, they wouldn't have designed the phase 3 clinical trial this way. When they realized the results of these 2 clinical trials would go nowhere, they did not amend the clinical trial, or they proposed in fact another clinical trial which did not correct for this possibility for the gene therapy to have an effect also on the contralateral eye. So instead, they looked if they could compare the vision of the patients in the phase 3 clinical trials to the vision of control groups of patients who had not been treated with a gene therapy. They never received the gene therapy in any of their eyes. And for this, they looked at 10 natural history studies that had been published. 2 were prospective and 8 were retrospective. And you see the numbers of patients and the number of eyes that could be compared, except that these data were of so poor quality that the expert at the European Medicines Agency rejected this comparison. You can only compare results from a clinical trial to natural disease history studies when these studies are well conducted, recent, and prospectively conducted, and so that you are sure you can compare both the clinical trials with these studies. And that wasn't the case here. So this indirect comparison was also rejected. What else did the company do? And this is again the apparent difference in efficacy between the patients treated in the clinical trial in red versus the natural disease history studies in blue. From this indirect comparison. But again, this kind of comparison was rejected because the quality of the natural disease history was not enough, did not meet the regulatory criteria to be used for such a study. So what did they do else? They launched the REFLECT phase 3 trial, which was again a double-masked, randomized clinical trial, and this is the design. They randomized an eye which would receive the gene therapy in a first group of patients, and the second affected eye, well, the first affected eye would receive the gene therapy immediately, and the second affected eye in the first group would receive the gene therapy when the symptoms would start. And other patients were randomized to receive the gene therapy in the first affected eye, but the second affected eye would receive a placebo. And they would compare the second affected eye receiving the gene therapy compared to the second affected eye that received the placebo. So with this, they needed 98 patients who were recruited in parallel to the 2 other clinical trials. But this did not prevent the gene therapy infected in the first affected eye to have an effect on the second affected eye. So this clinical trial, even if the design was different from the 2 ones, was not designed in a way to exclude this or to correct this effect, the fact that the gene therapy would have an effect in both arms. And this is what you see at the end of this clinical trial. And again, the comparison was between the second affected eyes, one receiving the gene therapy in yellow, one receiving the placebo. And you see the difference is too small. And as said by the company, the primary endpoint was not met. So even in this clinical trial with a more complex design, you could see a trend from baseline to the end of the trial, but here the main evaluation criteria was the difference between the second affected eyes one that received a gene therapy immediately after the symptoms occurred, and the other one where they received a placebo. So the results of this clinical trial could only be rejected based on this evaluation criteria as per the clinical trial protocol. The primary endpoint was not met. With this, the company sought scientific advice on 6 occasions with the EMA. The marketing authorization application was submitted on the 3rd of November 2020, but before that, the company benefited from 6 meetings in total, from 2014 to 2018. 2 were on the clinical development, and patient representatives took part in these scientific advice meetings, and 4 were about the quality and manufacturing aspects without patient representatives. It's rare to have so many scientific advice meetings for one product. It's equally rare to have 4 out of the 6 focusing on quality and manufacturing problems. And that was an indication that in addition to the clinical difficulties to assess efficacy, the company was also struggling with quality and manufacturing aspects. An oral explanation was planned in April 2023 when the CAT was evaluating all the results in the context of the marketing authorization applications with clinicians and one patient representative who was not very knowledgeable on the topic and on the procedure. It was a decision-making phase, and at that stage, the EMA cannot consult with patients who may have been influenced by the company. For example, patients who had been meeting regularly and recently with the company, applying the policy on conflicts of interest, could not be consulted by the EMA. That was a strict implementation of the rules on conflicts of interest. And with this, on the day that followed the meeting of the Committee of Advanced Therapies in April 2023, the company sent a letter to the EMA to withdraw their marketing authorization application due to the divergences by the committee members on the clinical results. And the letter to the EMA or the press release did not at all mention the quality and manufacturing objections. They were only commenting on the divergences on the clinical results. What was the EMA saying about this withdrawal? And we are now expecting the full details of the scientific discussion, but whenever a decision to withdraw a marketing authorization application is made by the company, the EMA publishes a question and answer document explaining what has happened, based on the information they had at the moment of the withdrawal. And that's what the EMA explained. At the time of the withdrawal, the opinion was that the gene therapy, Lumevoq, could not be authorized to treat LHOA. And this because the results from clinical studies did not demonstrate significant difference in vision comparing the eye treated with Lumevoq, the gene therapy, compared to a sham injection, which was the basis of all the clinical trial development. And if you fail to reach your objective, to reach your primary endpoint, it's extremely difficult to rescue the evaluation of the product. Sometimes the secondary endpoints can indicate that the product is effective, but then you have to be completely clean on the safety profile and the quality aspect of your product, which wasn't the case. The EMA continued, the clinical studies were not convincing to suggest that injecting the gene therapy in both eyes would represent a clinical benefit for patients. And there were concerns regarding laboratory tests in the dossier on the product manufacturing and on the site selected for the commercialization. As a result, the agency was of the opinion that benefits were not enough to outweigh the risks. When your clinical trial results are not convincing, and when in addition you have concerns, major objections on the quality of the gene therapy and on the site selected for this commercialization, that's Hereditary. You cannot obtain a marketing authorization. There is no way you can rescue the evaluation when you have so strong opposition to the product. The company indicated a possible price, not to the EMA, but in other discussions, about 650,000 euros per injection. And this has to be also considered for HTA. Suppose that finally the EMA would have granted a marketing authorization which such limits on the clinical outcomes, on the clinical effect of the product, with no clinical studies ever reaching its primary endpoint. It's not likely that many HTA bodies would have accepted to reimburse the product anyway. So what are Gensight's new plans? Possibly to submit a second marketing authorization application when the current problems will be solved, with a big question mark. That means to generate new data, more solid, more convincing, and to solve the quality issues. But by when? Secondly, Gensight is rejecting the EMA opinion and continues to believe Lumevoq is effective based on clinical trial results and on real-world data. They could reapply immediately, and then different rapporteurs would be selected, probably. We don't know if Gensight will submit a marketing authorization application to the FDA, a new drug application to the FDA, and if they do, when would that be? Anyway, there will be discussions between FDA and EMA as part of the rare disease cluster to share their mutual evaluation of the product and the quality concerns. So Gensight has started to consult all actors, including actors they did not really want to engage with before, and this includes patient advocates. There is no community advisory board for LHON, and some prominent advocates for the disease did not have a possibility really to influence the clinical trial, the design. One person said she received the clinical trial protocol in an evening to send comments back to the company the next day, the morning at 7 a.m. And again, these people cannot read with this condition. So not easy to comment 100 pages clinical trial protocol. So that was not a serious engagement from the side of the company. In any case, the question is whether or not they have the financial resources to continue investing in Lumevoq, or even just to survive. So that's how serious the case is for Gensight. So what lessons? The absence of the demonstration of an efficacy doesn't mean the product is not effective. It means the company failed to demonstrate it is effective if it is. The company failed to generate convincing evidence. It's a subtle difference. We cannot exclude at this stage that the product is effective. What we know is that Gensight failed to show the efficacy. Do they have the resources to restart the clinical development or to sell Lumevoq to a different company, but then who? Would this be the end of the company? And what about the Chinese Lumevoq? Will they commercialize the gene therapy because it's exactly the same in the world after Gensight failure, at least in the EU? If we ask Gensight to generate new data which new phase 3 clinical trials, different from all the three, rescue, reverse, and reflex, can we think of? And are patients with the condition ready to accept a placebo as a control and a true placebo, which should be at least the vector, or not, now that the community is often convinced that the product is effective, even if the company failed to demonstrate this efficacy? The fact that 252 people were exposed to Lumevoq, that could really be a problem to design a new clinical trial. Can we think of a better quality natural disease history study that would require time and money? The quality and the manufacturing challenges need to be solved, and that addresses a more general question: is there an issue with the French gene therapy filière or with the European gene therapy filière? In total, the EU has invested a lot in manufacturing chains for gene therapies, and yet we continue to have issues with the quality and the manufacturing. And 90%, for example, of the plasmids that are needed for gene therapies continue to be imported from the US. We're not there yet to produce these gene therapies. Some insight on the shareholders. One question was, which company could be interested to acquire a Lumevoq from Genzyme? Back in 2019, we had Novartis as part of the main shareholders, but in 2023, Novartis is no longer there. We still have the BPI, Banque Publique d'Investissement in France, and we have the Chinese company, and Arix Bioscience. These two in blue might be the only ones able to continue the development. But Novartis apparently withdrew from shareholders of the company. The good thing with Novartis is that they know how to manufacture gene therapies. They have several gene therapies on the market, but apparently they lost interest for this one. So lastly, final lessons learned. Before 2016, the EMA scientific advice concluded already on the poor quality of historic data, hence the necessity to have clear and convincing phase 3 clinical trial results. Genzyme said they met with association in 2016, but who exactly and what did they discuss? What was the outcome of these discussions? No idea, no information, and there is no community advisory board for this development to accompany, to guide these developments. In 2019, the company understood that the gene therapy had an effect in both eyes, but there was no substantial trial amendment, no discussion to see how we could resolve the question from the clinical trials that were in progress. Probably they should have been interrupted and a completely new clinical trial development should have been proposed, but they did nothing, probably because that was the year where they were at high risk of bankruptcy and they could not invest in a fourth clinical trial. They had to continue with the clinical trials that they had launched. Why didn't they consult with OrphanDev or Asterix to see if there was another type of clinical trial they could come with to show efficacy? And remember, there was an agreement for the co-development of the gene therapy between Genzyme and the Institut de la Vision. Could the Institut de la Vision have influenced Genzyme from within this agreement? We don't know. Was the Institut de la Vision consulted on these difficulties when they emerged? That is not known. And Could urgent discussions between GenSide investigators, patient representatives from different countries help at this stage? Is there something we can rescue from all this data, from all these developments, or discuss together a new clinical trial? Again, why isn't there a community advisory board for the disease, for the condition? We have some patients who are active, but they're more isolate or single initiatives, which we know are much less effective than collective actions. Only collective actions can succeed. So the next steps, what could they be? First, we are expecting the EMA scientific evaluation when it will be published to know exactly what were the objections of the Committee of Advanced Therapies and the CHMP. We need to understand how they interpreted the clinical trial results, but also to read on the quality issues and manufacturing issues. We can ask to the EMA an explanation on all these issues. A strong advice to patient groups to meet GenSide and their partners, clinicians, more patients to discuss their plans, including financial planning, and this can be done under confidentiality agreements. But also to meet with other gene therapy actors, Novartis, Orcad, Axis, Avexis, to explore their interest to acquire the gene therapy from GenSide, and to organize a European Leber Hereditary Optic Neuropathy community, which has been lacking during the Lumevoq development. And with this, I thank you for your attention.